inshallah, in 2024 with Shaykh Ahmed Al Azhary. I'll be briefly introducing the Shaykh, inshallah, and then I'll very quickly hand it over to him so you can hear him speak. You're not here to hear me speak. You can hear me in our formal classes, inshallah. Okay, so Shaykh Ahmed Al Azhary, or Shaykh Ahmed Hussein Al Azhary, he's a scholar in Islamic intellectual history and traditional Islamic sciences. He's a fellow at Tabah Foundation in Abu Dhabi, but also a director of religious affairs and social enterprise at MIJ International Hub and the Forgotten Souls. He has contributions which extend to the founding of Miftah Academy, specializing in curricula in Islamic psychology, also Qiyas Institute, and providing courses in Islamic philosophy and classical Islamic logic. He's edited several wonderful publications on education and psychology, and also in post-classical scholarly community, the art of deep reading of classical texts, one of which is a compendium of 7 treatises edited by the Shaykh, al-Mutali fi Adāb al-Mutali. He's currently working on the 2nd edition of this text, mashallah, the art of reading in the classical Islamic tradition. And obviously, for many of you, the relevance of this topic for the way in which you approach and handle and contemplate the text that you read is obvious, inshallah. I just want to add a personal anecdote. I've heard a lot about the Shaykh for a very long time, and I've been reading these wonderful treatises edited by this mysterious Shaykh Ahmed Al Azhary. But then I got the fortunate opportunity, inshallah, alhamdulillah, a few weeks ago, or actually a few months ago now, to meet him in Australia on tour. And we spent a wonderful day together, contemplating the beautiful seas and waters of Australia. Alhamdulillah. Tayyib, Maulana, over to you, inshallah. You can introduce the title and the floor is yours. I'm going to recede into the background, inshallah.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على حضرة سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم افتح علينا حكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك يا أكرم الأكرمين. أما بعد, so alhamdulillah, Jazakumullah ta'ala khairan for this kind and honorable invitation. And alhamdulillah, just a quick remark before we delve into today's talk, inshallah. I'm currently in Jakarta, and alhamdulillah, I'm very honored by the fact that Dr. Samir, alhamdulillah, has reached out to organize this talk with all of you guys, alhamdulillah, which I'm greatly honored being amongst all of you, alhamdulillah. And I told him that I'll be having a program in Jakarta, but I mean, this is an invitation that I cannot turn down. I'm very, alhamdulillah, feel very blessed to be collaborating with Usul Academy in conducting this talk. But today I was in a program, and returning back to my place of residence usually takes like half an hour, but it was giving me like over an hour. So we had to scramble, find a co-working space, which I'm in a Zoom room. That's what they call it. So please forgive me also with the slides. I'm using my phone. But I did not want to miss this, by any means, and I was looking for a stable internet connection and so on and so forth. So please forgive me that if you prefer to find PowerPoint presentations and you don't find that in the talk, please, my apologies. But inshallah, at some point we'll be sharing part of the PDF of the work that I've done on Adāb al-Mutali, on the art of deep reading. Which is titled al-Matali fi Adāb al-Mutali. We'll be covering that, inshallah. Parts of it, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, at some point in the talk, inshallah. So, alhamdulillah. So today, inshallah, we'll be talking about the art of deep reading in the Islamic tradition. And let me begin with an anecdote. I know maybe one, at least, of the attendees here might know of this story before. And it goes back close to a decade almost, when I was working on the uh, very first treatise included in al-Matali fi Adāb al-Mutali, which is رسالة في آداب المطالعة by al-Allāmah Hamid al-Ghifari, which is, by the way, also at the same time, subhanallah, Professor Khalid Ar-Ruwayhib, Hafidhahullah wa Jazallah ta'ala khair, he was working on his book as well, the Islamic Intellectual History in the 17th century, and I did not know, by the way. And subhanallah, just before the publication of my work, I learned from a friend and a researcher in Oxford then, that there's a book that came out that discusses Adāb al-Mutala'a in a chapter, which he titled Deep Reading. And subhanallah, when I had a chance to read the chapter, I found that he was covering also the same treatise. But we'll come to speak about this comparison. We'll come to talk about it later on, inshallah. So this رسالة في آداب المطالعة by al-Allāmah Hamid al-Ghifari, it's the first treatise that I included in al-Matali'. When I was working on it at that time, almost a decade ago, it didn't cross my mind that it will turn to be a compendium, a majmū'. And I remember that the chair of Ma'had al-Fath in Syria, Shaykh Abdul Fattah al-Bizm, he was visiting Cairo, and he conducted a lecture on طلب العلم at مضيفة Shaykh Ismail Sadiq al-Adawi, and at that time I was also teaching there as well. So I attended his lecture, and after the lecture I presented to him the work that I've been doing. And before he looked into the manuscript and so on and so forth, he asked me the following question. He told me, did the author title his treatise Adāb al-Mutala'a? I told him, نعم مولانا. He said he titled it Adāb al-Mutala'a. I was like, نعم, and it covers all the different techniques and methods about how to read a book. And he was completely astonished. And the reason I'm mentioning this anecdote, because I believe that Adāb al-Mutala'a, maybe for the past 2 centuries or so, almost became a forgotten and almost extinct discipline altogether, to the point that some of the scholars of high caliber in our time, while they might be practicing Adāb al-Mutala'a, or that's هذا هو الظن بهم, this is what we think of them, that they apply it, but as a discipline that is taught independently, for example, or as a complementary discipline to other disciplines, it almost went extinct. Now, just to draw another comparison, that when I published the work Adāb al-Mutala'a, many people in Cairo and in Egypt, where the book has been published, again, many of the students of knowledge, the shuyukh and scholars, were almost again in complete surprise that there is something called Adāb al-Mutala'a, especially that it came out in a form of a compendium of more than one treatise. And interestingly, that this compendium, it includes a chapter and an introduction of the work by al-Allāmah Abdullah al-Faqih, who wrote a work titled Matlab al-Iqād. Now, Matlab al-Iqād is basically a work on the Shafi'i nomenclature, the different Shafi'i terminologies, and it basically provides a roadmap how to decipher Shafi'i textbooks and Shafi'i commentaries. His muqaddimah, his introduction, is titled Muqaddimah fi Adāb al-Mutala'a. This muqaddimah that was written by Allāmah Abdullah al-Faqih was reiterated as well afterwards in a chapter on Adāb al-Mutala'a in al-Fawā'id al-Makkiyya, which is again another book on Shafi'i nomenclature. And it's a very popular book, especially within the Azhari milieu in a sense. there's a very famous compendium that is sold at a famous bookstore behind Jami' al-Azhar, Maktabat al-Halabi, where people would usually visit Maktabat al-Halabi to buy, especially Shafi'is. I'm a Hanafi, by the way, just side note, but Shafi'is, we have plenty of Shafi'is in Egypt. So when you go behind Jami' al-Azhar, you find Maktabat al-Halabi, they have a book, a compendium called Sab'a Kutub Mufida, 7 beneficial texts. One of them is Al-Fawaid al-Makkiyya. And Al-Fawaid al-Makkiyya is a work on, again, on Shafi'i nomenclature. It's not as on the same level of Matlab al-Iqath, but it's beneficial for them as a beginner level in this type of treatises. So Sab'a Kutub Mufida, within it is Al-Fawaid al-Makkiyya, and within Al-Fawaid al-Makkiyya there is a chapter on Adāb al-Mutala'. So despite that Al-Fawaid al-Makkiyya is being read within Al-Azhari community, and despite that Matlab al-Iqath, by the way, I forgot to mention that Matlab al-Iqath was also read within the community of scholars in Yemen and Tarim, and the introduction is on Adāb al-Mutala'. And yet, it seems that as students and scholars and teachers, as they go through these books, they didn't give so much attention to it, or at least they didn't treat Adāb al-Mutala' as an independent discipline, meaning a discipline of its own, where there's a founder, treatises that were written, commentaries, different styles, different approaches, different nomenclatures, and so on and so forth. They treated it as if it's some kind of a fa'ida, some kind of a benefit that Allama Abdullah al-Faqih chooses to mention in his introduction, that the author al-Habshi in al-Fawaid al-Makkiyya would also mention in a chapter, and so on and so forth, rather than something that is independent on its own, like Adāb al-Bahth, for example, the dialectics, or like al-Mantiq, the art of logic. So they treated these chapters and so on and so forth as if they're just fawaid, mere benefits, almost like, side notes in a sense, just some kind of remarks. So this was basically the reality when the compendium was being published, and I'm not here to speak about the compendium per se, the majmua per se of al-Mutali' fi Adāb al-Mutali', or fi Adāb al-Mutali', but rather to speak about the science of Adāb al-Mutali', or the discipline of Adāb al-Mutali'. I mentioned earlier that the first treatise that I worked on was the treatise by al-Allama Hamid al-Ghifari, who is also, subhanAllah, this is something really interesting, that just as Adāb al-Mutala' is not so known as a discipline nowadays, also the scholars who wrote on Adāb al-Mutala', not all of them are well known. Allama Hamid al-Ghifari was a scholar from Persia. He has super commentaries in Balagha. He has super commentaries on philosophical theology as well. He wrote this treatise, Adāb al-Mutala'. Then there's another scholar named Shaykh Alim al-Hanafi. Shaykh Alim al-Hanafi seems to be comes from India, or the subcontinent, and it seems that he lived at some point in Mecca. He authored a treatise called Sharh Risalat Adāb al-Mutala'. It's a commentary on a treatise on Adāb al-Mutala'. And this Sharh by Shaykh Alim al-Hanafi, he does not name al-Allama Hamid al-Ghifari, though when we compare between the treatise by al-Allama Hamid al-Ghifari and the treatise by Shaykh Alim al-Hanafi, it seems that he definitely read the text, because he's actually explaining the bulk of it. He doesn't cover the introduction, doesn't really cover the conclusion, but the main bulk of the treatise, he covers it in his commentary. And this very treatise by al-Allama Hamid al-Ghifari, which has been explained, or most of it was explained by al-Allama Halim al-Hanafi, and was later on published, by the way, about maybe a century and a half ago in Mecca, was the same one that was, you could say, regenerated by Al-Allama Abdullah al-Faqih and then in Al-Fawaid al-Makkiyah. So the inspiration by Al-Allama Hamid al-Ghifari basically transcends the, from Persia to Mecca and Yemen and reached India as well. The treatise by Al-Allama Ali al-Hanafi, I came across not only the manuscript, but also the Meccan print of it and also the old Indian print of it. And the reason I'm mentioning these prints, because the old prints gives you an idea how the text traveled throughout the Muslim world, basically. If the book is printed in India, which that would mean that there are scholars in India they have been reading this text on Adāb al-Mutala'a. If it's published in Mecca a century and a half ago, then students of knowledge in Mecca, 150 years ago, were reading on a textbook on Adāb al-Mutala'a. So the text by Allama Hamid al-Ghifari basically traveled throughout time and spaces as well within the Muslim world. Professor Khalid al-Wahib, he mentioned one or two manuscripts of this work in his book, but what I came across, there are many manuscripts of it, by the way. Some of them actually there was a manuscript at Harvard which he did not mention, by the way, in his book. But there are manuscripts of the Risala of Allama Hamid al-Ghifari all over the world. There's maybe 2 or maybe 3 copies in Egypt, 2 or 3 in Turkey. There is multiple also in Iran. I came across a Persian translation of the work as well in Iran. So it has been all over the world. Yet Allama Hamid al-Ghifari himself is not so well known. Having said that, let me move a little bit from the historical aspect to, the origin, you could say, of Adāb al-Mutali. And Allama Hamid al-Ghifari was around the 10th century Hijri. So we're talking about a discipline that was born over 400 years ago. We can definitely make that conclusion, that it was born over 400 years ago. Ilm Adāb al-Mutala'a basically takes from the following disciplines. It takes from Usul al-Fiqh. It takes from the different sciences of language. So it takes from al-Naḥw, it takes from al-Sarf. It takes from the different branches of Balagha, and it takes from logic, and it takes from Adāb al-Bahth. If you basically take all these disciplines that I just mentioned, Usul al-Fiqh, obviously not the entire of Usul al-Fiqh, but primarily the chapters in Usul al-Fiqh that have to do with interpretation. So, for example, Hujjat al-Sunnah would not be incorporated in there. The chapter on Ijma' would not be incorporated in there. But chapters on Aam wa Khas, Mutlaq wa Muqayyad, that sort of thing, that will be included. So, Usul al-Fiqh, Nahw, Sarf, Balagha with its branches, al-Mantiq, and Adāb al-Bahth. So if you take all of these together, put them in a blender, metaphorically, put them in a blender, and then add to that some of the etiquettes that are related to the treatment of books from Adāb al-Alim wal-Muta'allim, like the work by Imam al-Zarnuji or Badr al-Din al-Zarkashi, and so on and so forth. When you put all these together, the end product, what will come out then, is the art of deep reading. And I'm not saying here that the art of deep reading is just merely a combination from all these different disciplines. There are different practices and principles that are mentioned, but what I'm trying to say is that this science basically derived many of its laws and principles based on these sciences and disciplines that I just mentioned. Adāb al-Mutala'a, one of the interesting things that we have to cover is basically the definition of Adāb al-Mutala'a. And there are a number of definitions. There's a definition that is provided by Shaykh Ali al-Hanafi. There's a definition that is provided also by by Al-Allama Rafi' al-Din al-Dihlawi, who's the son of Shah Waliullah Dihlawi, other than Shah Abdul Aziz, another son of Shah Waliullah Dihlawi. Shah Abdul Aziz, his role in terms of the sciences of his father is different than Rafi' al-Din. Rafi' al-Din was very, Shah Abdul Aziz, you could almost say that he himself also has this ijtihadi spirit, but he was more Hanafi than Shah Waliullah Dihlawi, and he had his own works and contributions. While Rafi' al-Din Dihlawi, the son of Shah Waliullah, he was very keen to compile all of the works of his father, or they could say the knowledge of his father to be more accurate, that has not been documented. So he has a work called Takmil al-Sina'a, and it basically it's a work that is dedicated for the sciences that Shah Waliullah Dihlawi spoke about. And he said that these are the sciences that Shah Waliullah invented or created. One of them is al-Mutali, by the way. He also has in Takmil al-Sina'a, he has a section or a division or a chapter on translation, on tarjama, and he has one on Adāb al-Mutali. So there are a number of definitions for Adāb al-Mutali. I like the definition by Shaykh Ali al-Hanafi. I mean, they're very close, but both of them, whether the definition by Shaykh Ali al-Hanafi or Rafi' al-Din al-Dihlawi and others, the core of the definition is basically on not just knowing how to read, but knowing how to read from the perspective of uncovering the intended meaning of the author. Uncovering the intended meaning of the author. And this perspective, you might think that it's a given, but actually in today's world, with postmodernist ways of reading, this perspective or this qualifier that is added to the definition of our scholars is really, really important, because it means that these texts that were written by scholars, they're not written in a vacuum, right? You cannot just invent meanings and attach it to them, right? But there's some kind of a treasure hunt when you read. Right? You're looking for the intended meaning. You're looking for a meaning that the author intended. Now, that doesn't mean that we make conclusions of certainty or certitude about the intended meanings. But since we're looking for the intended meaning, we would have to also know that these meanings, there are certain ways of expressing them. And the art of reading is about knowing these expressions that the scholars use to express these meanings. So your role then, basically as a reader, based on this definition, your role as a reader is basically you walk back the same journey that the author went. You're walking in the opposite direction. It's almost like a highway, and the author is going this way and the reader is coming that way. So you walk back the same track. You walk back the same track. I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but I like it. Right? You walk back the same track of the author. So it's not it's not like the death of the author by like Roland Barthes type of a theory or an idea where the readers just merely project the meanings onto the text, and the author has is completely separated from the text that they authored or that they generated, and then the readers they project meanings onto the textbooks without any clear path whether to evaluate this reading is accurate or false, is close or far to the intended meaning. So this is the definition. The definition basically boils down to looking for the intended meaning of the authors. How do we look for the intended meanings of the authors? طيب. Now we move to another subject. We had a little bit of a historical background. I didn't want to, drown you with history, but we can come back to it, inshallah, if you'd like. And then this is the definition. So the definition, basically, as we learn from scholars, that objectives they define or they guide us to know the instruments. So if our objective in the art of deep reading is to uncover the intended meanings of the authors of our tradition, then what are the tools that the authors of our tradition use to write? Because we would need the same tools to decipher what they have written. And this is why I mentioned these sciences or disciplines earlier. So we mentioned Usul al-Fiqh, we mentioned Nahw and Sarf, we mentioned the Balagha, we mentioned the Mantiq, we mentioned Adāb al-Bahth, because these are the tools that the scholars, especially for the exception of Usul al-Fiqh, I'll come back to it. These are the tools that they use. They're writing in Arabic, so Arabic is governed structurally by grammar, by Nahw and Sarf. And then they also write in different styles, so this is why you need Balagha. They provide arguments in their books, so you need the mantiq so you can evaluate these arguments, and this is key. And they also evaluate, or you could say debate, ideas and opinions within their textbooks. So they apply Adāb al-Bahth in their writing. So people usually think that Adāb al-Bahth is needed merely so that when you sit in a debate, and unfortunately, some brothers, maybe sisters as well, they try to force people on social media to apply Adāb al-Bahth. Well, I mean, it's a kind of far-fetched objective, and to have people on social media apply Adāb al-Bahth. But Adāb al-Bahth was basically used in textbooks to debate with the opponent, for example, and provide evaluations. And I'll come to speak about that in a little bit, inshallah, when we speak about evaluations of opinions. So this definition of Adāb al-Mutala'a defines for us the kind of sciences that we will need to use and utilize as we read. Because these are the sciences that were used by the authors to confine the meanings. See, I also like to think of Adāb al-Mutala'a, it's a very liberating science as well. Why? Because your role as a reader is to liberate the meaning after it has been confined in the words of the author, right? And one of the scholars in Adāb al-Mutala'a speak about this is Allama Ahmed ibn Lutfillah al-Mivlevi, who is also known as Munash al-Bashi, who authored Fayd al-Haram fi Adāb al-Mutala'a. In there, he mentions that al-Mutali', if you really want to be at the level of a reader of a tradition that has mastery of Adāb al-Mutala'a, is to have the ability of spotting the meaning irrespective of the qalib, irrespective of the words that have been used to convey the meaning. He said this. He also said that not only that you'll be able to spot. He uses a metaphor. He says it's as if the meaning is a close friend of yours. So whenever you see your friend, you can, regardless of what clothes they're wearing, you're able to know them, right? You're not surprised if they're wearing a costume or different. Let's say I'm a friend of yours and I come today wearing Indonesian, for example. You'd know me. If I'm wearing something else, a suit and a tie, you'd still know me. So Allama al-Mivlevi was saying that the reader, to reach a level of mastery, the indication of reaching a level of mastery is knowing the meaning irrespective of the words that are used to convey that meaning. And then he also added, and then the fruit of that is also to be able to convey that meaning in more than one language, not just Arabic. And subhanAllah, that was said by Allama Mavlevi about 3 centuries ago in his work Fayd al-Haram fi Adāb al-Mutala'a. Now, I told you that I'll come back to Usul al-Fiqh. The reason I mentioned Usul al-Fiqh, the reason I told you I'll come back to Usul al-Fiqh is that the Usul al-Fiqh that they spoke about is the Usul al-Fiqh of al-Mutakallimin. Because Hanafis, in their works, they say that they interpret their textbooks not according to the Usul al-Fiqh of Hanafis. Usul al-Fiqh of Hanafis only apply to the Quran and with it Sunnah. But the Usul al-Fiqh that is used in understanding the works of the scholars is the Usul al-Fiqh of al-Mutakallimin, and this we can derive from that that even a Hanafi student, at some point after they study the Hanafi Usul Fiqh, they ought to study the Usul Fiqh of al-Mutakallimin, because that is the one that is applied in Adāb al-Mutala. These are the tools through which you will interpret the Hashiyat ibn Abidin or Fath al-Qadir by Ibn al-Humam. You apply in your interpretation Usul al-Fiqh of al-Mutakallimin, not Usul al-Fiqh of the Hanafis. Now, the scholars of Adāb al-Mutala, they took different approaches in their treatises. Allama Hamid al-Ghifari, basically, his treatise is threefold. The introduction is on the different sorts of fallacies, whether fallacies or errors, you could say, that occur whether in conceptualizations or in propositions. And then al-Maqsad, which is the bulk of the treatise, is on the steps of Adāb al-Mutala'a, and he divided the steps into two main steps, you could say. The first one is basically having a general overview of the text. So you could say it's a scan of the text. And the scan of the text, you're not supposed to pause while you're doing it to look at meaning for the meaning of a word in a dictionary, for example, or to evaluate a syllogism, or to double check for something. No, you're just basically creating a tawajjuh towards to have an inner direction towards what you will come to read in details afterwards. So this is the first step, and it overlaps with a method that has been mentioned also by Mortimer Adler in his book, How to Read a Book. And we'll come to talk about some of the Western texts at the end, and whether there are any relations to the ones in our Islamic tradition. So this is the first step, basically. It's a scan. You don't pause during it to evaluate anything. You're basically just getting an idea of what you're about to read. To be more specific, Allama Hamid al-Ghifari said that you do this to the mabhath. Now, al-mabhath is not the entire book. Al-mabhath is basically an issue, a mas'ala, from beginning to end. So it's the position, the argument for it, maybe a refutation of opposing arguments, until all the discussion on this mas'ala ends, and then they move to another mabhath. So a mabhath is almost like they use that term to refer to a mas'ala. But see, whether a mabhath or a mas'ala, both of them, they're basically propositions. And you can think of them as conclusions. But the reason we call these conclusions mas'ala, because mas'ala is masdar mimi. So basically, because they look at each issue, each proposition, from the perspective that it's something that is being inquired about. So we call it mas'ala. But if you look at this conclusion or this opinion from the perspective, not that there's an inquiry about it, but rather from the perspective that there is a debate about it. So you call it mabhath. So take any opinion. Take that Hanafis consider that it's sufficient to wipe only part of the head. This is a conclusion. Now, if you look at this issue, this proposition, from the perspective that there's an inquiry about it, you're going to call it mas'ala. If you're going to look at it from the perspective that there is a debate about it, so there's an argument and there's a back and forth, and then there's a refutation of the opposing argument, and there's a defense of our own argument, and so on and so forth, then there's a bahth. So this proposition becomes a mabhath. This is where you're going to do the debate. So he says that you go through this mabhath, whether there's the opinion or the proposition, the defense for it, the argumentation, and so on and so forth. Right? You go from beginning to end. Once you do the scan, then you go back to read it in a deciphering way, where you notice the conceptualizations and the propositions, where you notice the opinion and the argument that is in support of it, where you notice all the different parts to it. The method that Allama Hamid al-Ghifari proposes is basically, when it comes to reading, he proposes an approach that I would say it's a critical reading. I mentioned that his introduction is based on fallacies, possible fallacies or errors that could happen that could occur from authors as they provide definitions, conceptualizations, or propositions, their opinions, and the supporting arguments of them. So after he provided this introduction, which is basically summarized from Adāb al-Bahth, and then he went through the first step of reading, which is the scanning that we just talked about, and then the detailed reading. The detailed reading, as I said, he had a critical approach. And what I mean by a critical approach is that he says, as you read, consider if there's any kind of a rejection, any kind of a critique that could be raised, whether it's a valid critique or not. Consider a critique that could be raised, and then provide an answer to the critique, and then provide a critique to the answer of the critique. And then he says, basically, he alludes to the fact that the more you can prolong this process, then you're a successful reader. The more you can prolong the process of you critique what you read, or you raise a critique. So basically, you put yourself in the shoes of an opponent of the author, and then you come back to be an advocate for the sake of the author, and then you move back to being an opponent, and then you come back to being a proponent. And the more you can develop cycles of these as you read, the better the reader you are. Whether these critiques are raised towards the conceptualizations aspect of the mabhath or the propositional aspect of the mabhath. This method was applied by Sayyid Sharif Jurjani, by the way, and it is mentioned in the biographies, but also quoted by Shaykh Ahmed al-Mavlavi in his work Fayd al-Haram. But he quoted this anecdote that I will share with you, not in the same context. He was not talking about this method of reading. So he was talking about reverence of the teacher. But he said that when Sayyid Sharif traveled to study with Mubarak Shah the Sharh of al-Shamsiyya. Now, Mubarak Shah was a student of Qutb al-Razi, Qutb Tahtani, the author of Sharh al-Shamsiyya. So he went to, and Sayyid Sharif was a distinguished scholar by then, and he already was a published author by then as well, and he studied that book maybe 2 times before, but he wanted to study it with Mubarak Shah per se. So when he went to study with Mubarak Shah, what happened is that Mubarak Shah rejected him to attend the lesson. He did not want him to attend, and he basically just had him sit at the back. And this is Sayyid Sharif Jurjani, Sharh Mawaqif, right? I mean, I think most of you are already well acquainted with who is Sayyid Sharif Jurjani. And Mubarak Shah had this habit that he would visit the rooms of his students at the hostel at night to check on them. So as he was passing by the room of Sayyid Sharif, he saw him debating with Mubarak Shah, but he would revere him. So he would debate, and then he would put himself in the shoes of Mubarak Shah, refute or respond, and then come back. So basically, it was almost like a simulation of a debate. And Sayyid Sharif was basically simulating the proponent and the opponent. He puts himself in the shoes of Mubarak Shah and back, vice versa. Right? He had this like role playing basically, and he used that in his reading, and he used that in his preparation for the study, for the subject matter. And it is said that when Mubarak Shah noticed this, the next day he basically told him, no, now you have to sit up front. Because of his adab and because of his dedication as well. So that was this is the approach of Al-Allama Hamid al-Ghifari. Another approach that we have in our tradition to Adāb al-Mutala is the approach of Ahmed ibn Lutfullah al-Mivlavi in Fayd al-Haram, which is basically an approach that is based on the type of malaka, the type of capacity of mastery that the reader wants to develop through reading. And he basically, or through their study in general. And the first malaka, he says, the first malaka is not something that students can develop from reading whatsoever. And it's called malakatul istihsal. Malakatul istihsal, he says, this is to have a mastery of the beginning level. And this mastery of the beginning level you get from your teachers. You don't get it from reading. But then when you move from malakat al-istihsal to malakat al-istikhraj, istikhraj basically having the ability to derive meanings from the texts. Tastakhrij, you're bringing something out from. So malakat al-istikhraj, this is basically where the art of reading would be applied. It is required to finish, to complete your malaka of istikhraj al-ma'ani, to derive meanings. You would need Adāb al-Mutala. And so then he mentioned all the different aspects of applying Adāb al-Mutala, but he took an interdisciplinary approach rather than a critical approach like Allāmah Hamid al-Ghifari. So he gave detailed advice on what should the reader do in terms of grammar, what should the reader do in terms of sarf, what the reader should do in terms of balagha, what the reader should do in terms of mantiq and Adāb al-Bahth. How to apply these ulum ala to a textbook that you're reading. And then he moved to the highest of malakat, of masteries, the different sorts of masteries, which is malakatul istihdar. Istihdar, so that it means basically that the knowledge becomes present, comes from the concept of hudur, right? And also the Sufis, they use the term hadra. So this that the knowledge becomes present. And when they say becomes present, meaning it becomes present in your mind, even if you're not indulged into any kind of activity related to the ilm itself. So it will be present in your mind, even when you think that your mind is idle, it still kind of works its way through the masail. And we know this, by the way, in our tradition. Some of the scholars, they used to keep next to their side as they go to sleep. They put to their side a paper and something to write with, because sometimes they wake up from their sleep with an idea or an answer to the question, and then that they had, so they would write it and then they go back to sleep. So because they knew that once the knowledge becomes at this level of istihdar, then it becomes as a second habit, or a second nature rather. Ibn Khaldun uses a term for this. He uses the verb, the dying of the dying, meaning like to color, that the soul becomes dyed with the knowledge that you're studying. And by the way, this and I won't get too much into this. This is related to Islamic psychology and medicine and so on and so forth. But you find some of the scholars, I think al-Kamil fi al-Sana'a al-Tibbiyya, they mention in there that some of they mention in there that careers influence your physical temperament and psychological temperament. Meaning, you regardless of how you're born, the innate temperament, the original temperament of your body and the original temperament of your psyche is basically altered or changed, developed, evolved, whatever you want to, which verb you want to use, by the career that you choose. So Ibn Khaldun uses this, that it's as if that the psyche or the mind is like a piece of cloth, and this piece of cloth, it becomes dyed with a new color. So it's as if it has a completely new nature. And also, when this becomes a second nature, then the entire existence of the person, it's as if it has this direction towards this type of knowledge. And this is when people start, and subhanAllah, in some respects, I experience events like this. Right? You would go to a library, you feel like all of a sudden I need to go to that bookstore for no other reason. You don't know why. I just need to go to that bookstore. Right? And sometimes when I have this urge, when I go to the bookstore, I don't leave until there's something. And subhanAllah, you find a book that is hidden about a subject that you were thinking about maybe a week or a month ago, and then you find the book. So sometimes with manuscripts, you find manuscripts in the midst of compendiums that has to do with something that you've been doing research about for a month or so, but you forgot about it. But subhanallah, your tawajjuh, there's a pull towards it. There's some kind of a jazba, right? So alhamdulillah. Now, so let me conclude with a third approach, because I think it's a really interesting one. Inshallah, in the next edition of this compendium, al-Matali fi Adāb al-Mutali, I will include a treatise by al-Allama Abdi al-Busnawi. Allama Abdi al-Busnawi, he's an Akbari Khalwati Sufi, who has a number of works on in the Akbari tradition. But he has a treatise on Adāb al-Mutala'a, and interestingly, he uses a mathematical approach, an approach of probabilities, almost like creating a matrix. And the way he details this, he basically says that when you read a statement, let's say that the statement is composed of 3 words. He says, first thing to do is look for the probable meanings that you have for each word. So if the probable meaning for each word, let's say 2, right? So you multiply, right? You multiply 2 by 3, so you have 6 different meanings for the sentence, for the statement that you're reading. And then he says, you basically rule out the far-fetched ones, and then whatever meanings that you're left with, you start to evaluate. So that was another approach that was taken, an interesting approach, rather, a mathematical approach that was taken by a Sufi scholar and saint, Maulana Abdi al-Busnawi. Was a Bosnian scholar, and then he also authored in traditional Ottoman language or Turkish language, taking this approach in Adāb al-Mutala'a. If I may, I know I'm running with the time. If I may squeeze something in there as well before we conclude, I mentioned that the Western tradition, there are works on the art of deep reading. There's How to Read a Book, which is a very famous work, of course, and there's a chapter on the art of reading in The Improvement of Mind by Isaac Watts. And then there are scattered, you could say, scattered advice on the art of reading in different works, especially from medieval classical authors and so on and so forth. But I think the notable ones that are related to, you could say, non-fiction academic reading rather than reading of literature, right, would be How to Read a Book and the chapter on reading from The Improvement of Mind. Many of the ideas in there, they overlap one way, shape, or form with the ideas that are mentioned in our tradition. But I don't think that this was a result of some kind of a stealing, as some people would call it. Someone might need to look into if there's an influence, that could be a possibility. But also, it seems that the underpinnings of The Improvement of Mind and How to Read a Book, it comes from the Christian medieval classical tradition. Whether that was influenced by Islam or not, this is something to do research in. But I'm not fond of trying to make a claim that everything has been originated in Islam and the West stole it from Muslims. I really treat these sort of claims with caution, and it's normal that there will be parallels basically between the different traditions. One more aspect, I know I'm doing terrible with the time, I guess. One more aspect which is very important. It's mentioned in Sharh Risalat Alim al-Hanafi. They provide basically a scheme of words that introduce opinions and the refutations of these opinions. Like, for example, the system of that is known as al-Fanqala. So, for example, they would present a critique by saying فَإِنْ قِيلَ قُلْنَا, or قَدْ يُقَال, or لِقَائِلٍ أَنْ يَقُول. So they use different terms, different expressions to introduce the opinion. Now, these terms were not used haphazard. There are actually, I have spotted 3 or 4 schools, different schools within our tradition, where these nomenclatures, they have different meanings according to the school that they've been used. So Imam al-Razi has a meaning. You find Kifavi mentions different meanings. Alim al-Hanafi. And basically these words, they define an evaluation of the critique and the response to it. Right? So if the critique is strong, they would use a word. If it's middle way, they would use a word. If it's weak, they would use a different word. And same thing when it comes to the responses. They also sometimes authors provide interjections of their own opinions, but they don't say this is my opinion, right? So Sharif Jurjani and Maulana Mullah Jami, they use قد يقال. It could be said. And Shaykh Ali Bilal Hanafi said, I learned from my teachers that قد يقالات of Maulana Abdul Rahman Jami and Sayyid Sharif, these are their own opinions, but because of their humbleness, they don't say it like my opinion, so and so. They say that it could be said, it might be said, but rather these are their opinions. And I haven't seen, I've been talking about Adāb al-Mutali and teaching Adāb al-Mutali since 2016 or something back in Egypt. I did some courses in there, and I used to recommend to students who are looking to do, let's say, a PhD or a master's, take one of those nomenclatures or one of these nomenclatures and do a reading, let's say, from al-Mawaqif. You can get all the opinions of Sayyid Sharif by and Maktaba Shamila now can help at least in the preparation steps for this. I mean, you cannot fully depend on it, but you can use it to find all the places in Sharh al-Mawaqif where it says قد يقال. This becomes like a thesis for you already. All the opinions of Sayyid Sharif within Sharh al-Mawaqif, because you will not be able to find it هكذا, on the spot. No, he uses قد يقال. Same thing with Maulana Jami. So this, unfortunately, these nomenclatures and or expressions that are used to introduce critiques and the responses, or to introduce opinions in the books, have been completely ignored. I have seen nowadays, even at the level of scholars, they read the terms as if as if the person is saying, and if it is said, then we will say. They don't realize that it's not merely an introduction of an idea, but rather an introduction that has an evaluation embedded within. So many of the scholars of the Hawashi, they use these. They use فَإِنْ قِيلَ, or they use لِقَائٍ أَنْ يَقُولْ, and they use قَدْ يُقَال, and they differentiate between each one because that's their own evaluation of the critique or the opinion that they're introducing. And we think that they're just merely introducing an idea, while it's actually an introduction that has an evaluation embedded within. And this aspect of Adāb al-Mutala is very, very rich, and many parts of it unfortunately hasn't been unearthed yet. Please forgive me. I know maybe I went a little bit over the time. I had 45 to an hour, but I guess I took the whole hour. I apologize.
No, it's absolutely. Did you want us to share that page 79?
Yes, we can. For the 3 minutes, I can show inshallah, the participants.
That one page, right? That one page. Page
we're gonna flip through them. So this is the Risala of Allama Hamd al-Ghifari. You can basically just turn the pages slowly. He begins with the preface, and then after the preface, yes, I think the 2 pages after this one as well. Yes, so this is basically still in the preface, and I write long footnotes. Yeah, so this is now after this immediately is this is the مقدمة. So where he says كل ما يذكر في كتب الفنون لا يخرج عن أحد أمرين. So all of what is mentioned in the works of the Islamic disciplines, it's either conceptualizations or propositions. And then following afterwards, he will start talking about the different sorts of errors that this is why he says فالإيراد الذي يتوجه على الأول مضبوط, meaning the type of critiques that can be raised towards conceptualizations has been actually outlined. مضبوط meaning it has been thoroughly and rigorously studied to the point that we have that all the different cases of errors or fallacies, they don't how do I explain this? They're basically cataloged. Yes, they're cataloged to the point that there aren't any fallacies or errors that can be introduced in additional to the catalog that is already available. So he mentions the conceptualizations, and then he moves to the propositions, and then after the fallacies that he includes in there, he moves on to speak on the maqsad. Now, yeah, we can continue flipping. These are still the different sorts of fallacies. Yeah, and then right after this is the maqsad, exactly. So إذا شرعت في المطالعة فانظر في المبحث من أوله إلى آخره نظرا إجماليا على وجه ينتقش ينتقش في ذهنك المعنى المراد منه ظاهر. See, he's talking about a face value meaning. He says, read it from beginning to end so that the face value meaning could be present in your mind. And then ثم, and see, he didn't say fa, لاحظ, ثم, because it will take a little bit of time just to scan. And then ثم لاحظ الأمور التصورية, he will say بدقة النظر, with an intricate way of reading, right? And then he goes into that as well. Consider the different what sort of critiques that can be raised. Can you find answers to these critiques? Can you find critiques to the answers, and go on and so on and so forth? This rumination type of a way. Now, yeah. One of the things that he mentions you could continue scrolling, CD. One of the things that he mentions at the very end, in the conclusion, is that he says, don't get yourself in a habit of doing the scanning without conducting the detailed reading. He says, because you can get into the habit of doing the scanning, and you lose the ability to do the detailed reading. And this is something that people now unfortunately suffer from because of all the browsing and the scanning that we do on social media. Then when we come to read a textbook, it feels tedious. I usually say to some of the students, you look at the textbook and you try to use your finger like you would do on the phone, right? But it doesn't. I mean, no matter what you do, the text just remains there, like looking at you. So he mentions that in there. He also mentions the almost like a prohibition of memorizing words that you don't understand. Obviously, the Quran would be an exception because of the blessing of the Quran, but he's saying words of scholars, especially technical. We're not talking about words of Sufis, for example, or ash'ar of Sufis, no, we're talking about, memorizing a book on logic or theology or fiqh. He says, make sure that whatever you memorize, that you understand, because getting in the habit of memorizing without understanding weakens your ability to understand. And I quoted in the footnotes Ibn Sina, where he talks about the capacity to memorize versus the capacity to the capacity of memory or recollection versus the capacity of rationality through which you interpret and through which you generate meanings and create syllogisms and so on and so forth. And basically, Ibn Sina says that it's impossible, naturally, of course, it's impossible naturally that one would reach the highest level of both, right? Very, very rarely in our tradition where you find a scholar of the highest degree in hifz, and he's also in the highest degree of istikhraj al-ma'ani. There are examples of this, but not a lot. There is an exception, however. Some of the scholars, and I also detailed that in the footnotes, some of the scholars talked about the benefit of memorization for understanding. Like Abu Bakr ibn Sarraj al-Nahwi, he used to say that if you don't understand my words, memorize them, because if you memorize them, you'll understand them. And what he meant by that is that, yes, it's fine to memorize words that you don't understand with a condition that you will keep recalling these words, seeking the meaning of these words. So it's not a mere recall. You're using the memorization to facilitate understanding. And this gives new perspective to what Allama Hamid al-Ghifari said. You can actually put a condition or a qualifier to what he said using the words of Abu Bakr ibn Sarraj. Also, same meaning was discussed in the class. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani had his students around him, and they had this discussion on pedagogy and writing while he was teaching al-Nukhba, because he mentioned that he authored al-Nukhba in a concise way, so that it would be easier to understand. So one of his students disagreed. He said, "Well, when you write a short, concise manual, it becomes easier to memorize. Why did you say that it's easier to understand?" He said, "Well, when it's easier to memorize, this would mean that when you come to the end of the science, at the end of the Nukhba, for example." Sorry, the beginning of it's still present in your mind. So the student, because the whole science is within their mind now by memorizing al-Nukhba or al-Bayquniya or al-Ajurrumiya, they can connect the beginning chapter with the end chapter in their mind. So when that happens, understanding can be facilitated, right? So they had this discussion on the relationship between memory and understanding, as well. So we can qualify the words of Allama Hamid al-Ghifari by saying that it is fine to memorize what you don't understand within a condition, which is you're using the memorization for the sake of understanding, not just mere memorization. If it's mere memorization, then it will hurt your capacity to understand. Yeah.
I'm always impressed by the breadth of your knowledge, mashallah, and reading the text you edit, the amount of footnotes. Usually there's as much commentary in the footnote exceeding actually the matan itself. This is a sign of a true scholar, mashallah.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. Sayyidina, we're going to go to Q&A. This is the opportunity now for students to ask their question. It is their time now, inshallah. So if anyone wants to ask any questions to Shaykh Ahmed, please raise your virtual hand. And then when I prompt you, you can ask the question, inshallah. Please do turn the camera on if you can, while you're asking the question. Okay, then I might start with my own question, Sayyidina. No, two questions actually, but we'll start with one first. How can this type of pedagogy, do you think, be integrated into the context of an educational institution, for example, like Usul or any other educational institution? How do you teach this?
Beautiful. Actually, the Jazakumullah ta'ala khair, Sidi. SubhanAllah, I wanted to mention this in the lecture, but I forgot. So Jazakumullah ta'ala khair for posing this. Sajjaqli Zada in Tartib al-Ulum proposed that students spend 1 year, obviously not 1 year solely for Adāb al-Mutala'a, but as they're studying, they have a parallel class for Adāb al-Mutala'a. And this parallel class, he speaks about this in Tartib al-Ulum. He says that this parallel class, the students are not supposed to finish a book. They're supposed to spend the whole year from beginning to end doing practices, training on how to apply the principles of Adāb al-Mutala'a on any given textbook. Whether they finish it or not, that's another issue. He says that's not the main concern. But he says they would need a year to develop that. And I think this quantification by Sajjaqli Zada makes sense, because I have read in the Sharh Shaykh Halim al-Hanafi mentioned 2 to 3 years, basically, to develop this ability of this practice of Adāb al-Mutala'a. So I would say that, for Usul Academy or any other academies, especially at the level of reading traditional textbooks, and to be honest, I have been urging academies to apply this, right? Just have a class that is kind of like a free flow, right? There isn't an objective to finish a book. They might read a whole chapter through a year, but that's fine. They're
Mm.
not, the aim is not to gain the knowledge of usul or kalam or fiqh. The aim is let them apply these principles, right, freely. So they will come out with crazy readings of, of Shurumbulali. They will come with crazy interpretations of يعني Abu al-Ma'ali Juwaini, whatever it may be. The aim here is just how, utilize the different sciences of um, علوم الآلة, the different instrumental sciences, to apply it in almost like in a mind gym. Um, I think if this is applied, whatever institution will apply this would be reviving and applying something that Sadiq Lizada was talking about. And by the way, it's
Mm.
not just Sadiq Lizada talks about in Tartib al-Ulum. And Professor Khalid Duwayhib mentioned that in his work. He mentioned the example of the Azhari scholars. He mentioned the example of Nur al-Ziyadi with al-Shibshiri. Nur al-Ziyadi was basically the Shaykh of Shafi'iyya in his time, and Sheikh Salim al-Shibshiri was his assistant, like a TA. And he used to do a preparatory workshop before the coming of Nur Zayadi. So and he said that this workshop was on mutala. So they would bring the chapter that Nur Zayadi would teach, and he would coach them on the method that Nur Zayadi applies in reading the Shafi'i textbooks, right? In how he prepared, in how the main teacher prepares for the class. And it is mentioned in the biography of Sheikh Shibshiri that some of the students of Nur Zayadi would enjoy the workshop with him more than the Nur Zayadi, because Nur Zayadi he's the serious professor. He comes, he sits, like he presents his, the mas'ala from beginning to end fully. But Shibshiri was close to their age, and uses more a practical approach to it. And those, I don't know if there are Shafi'is in the meeting, or in this event, rather. Some of the scholars like Bijirmi, for example, used to attend this. I mean, Bijirmi was one of the notable late Shafi'is, who has a Hashia on al-Iqna' and a number of important late Shafi'i textbooks, and he used to attend that. So this was an Azhari way, which is different than the role of al-Mu'id. Al-Mu'id, which is mentioned by Imam al-Razi, mentioned by Taj al-Subki in Mu'id al-Ni'am or Mu'id al-Niqam. The role of al-Mu'id in a classroom was to repeat the lesson after the teacher leaves. Salim Shibshiri used to do something else. He used to do a preparatory session before the class, in comparison to the role of al-Mu'id, which is basically to repeat the class for anyone who missed a part, to review. Someone has a question, someone didn't understand something, that comes at the end after. Yeah.
Mm. MashaAllah, it's unfortunate the Mu'eed now is Zoom, recorded Zoom lecture. We just repeat the same lecture.
Right.
Maulana, we have a question from one of the students. Can we say that the malakat derived from the ulum you mentioned brought forth this field?
The malakat are?
The malakat derived from the ulum you mentioned, usul al-fiqh, nahwu, sarf, balagha, mantiq, adab, al-bahar. The malakat that come out of this field, are they the ones that brought forth the art of this deep reading? Is that correct,
This is,
Amro?
yeah, this is
Yeah.
the argument that is presented by Alama Hamid al-Ghifari and Ahmed Hussein al-Mablawi.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But I have an additional question if none of the students want to ask. Is there a different application of this method? Does it differ when I'm thinking here of Lectio Divina and or the reading of text with a Sheikh Murshid? Is there a different way of reading a text if it presupposes a certain kind of suluk? Or is this reading more like restricted to the kind of ta'aleem in the madrasa kind of context?
Um, uh, I mean, this is a very good question. I would say it is, yes, for the most part, it is for the disciplines um, yes, for a ta'lim context. So we're talking about علوم المقاصد in terms of fiqh and in terms of kalam and in terms of tafsir and hadith and so on and so forth. For Sufi texts, I think it is for the most part, and I'm saying for the most part because there are some kind of Sufi texts that were written in a way that can be used as in a ta'limi context, in a sense. But if we were talking about works, for example, and to be more specific, in a sense, works of a, let's say, of a of whether in poetry or prose, but especially in poetry. But works by Akbari Sufis, or in fact, Maulana Abdul Karim al-Jili, he said that reading the Sufi textbooks while having belief in the author, meaning reverence and belief that they're a great saint and so on and so forth, having some kind of a connection or a direction, a spiritual direction, alignment rather than direction, a spiritual alignment with the author, that can yield suluk, that can yield elevation in the spiritual path, and the meanings would eventually unfold, unravel gradually as the one develops and progresses through the path. But obviously, Shaykh Abdul Karim al-Jili himself, reading his books, for many Sufis, not theologians, but for many Sufis as well, they put certain conditions for the students to and for the disciples and muridin and so on and so forth to read them. But one could benefit from his recommendation, however, some way, shape, or form. Especially, for example, in awrad. But again, these issues, the difficulty in answering them, because as we say, كل شيخ ولو طريقة, يعني each sheikh has his own method, and also this method could, the application of it, the practicality of it could differ from one murid to another, and so on. I mean, because this is more personal and individualized type of education, rather than like a whole set of a classroom where students are gathered in circles and there are different grades of students, and it becomes more individualized. The advice here would be more individualized. So I'm afraid, you could sense that even in my answer, I'm trying to mention as many qualifiers and conditions as possible, because it greatly differs from one scholar to another, from one tariqah to another, from one sheikh to another, one murid to another.
Yeah. Amr al-Ghar, do you have a question? Afwan. Your hand is up, yes?
This is a continuation of the first question. With regards to bringing forth other fields, when we talked about malakat, can we differentiate between this and some people that do what they call nowadays tawlid al-ulum, where they just take certain principles from certain ulum and try to address other fields or be creative in other fields rather than actually reaching a malaka before doing so? Barakallahu feekum.
The last part of your question I didn't get. I got the idea of tawlid al-ulum, but if you could reiterate this.
I'm trying to differentiate between having a malaka first and then going into another ilm or bringing forth a new field, versus just knowing certain principles of a ilm and trying to solve another problem in another field or bringing forth another field.
Okay, I'll do my best with this one. Okay, let me start with the notion of tawlid al-ulum first, because I think this is important, because many brothers and sisters, many students of traditional sciences, they think that this concept of the emergence of new ulum that branch from the tradition is is naturally impossible or something like that. Meanwhile, one of the Ottoman scholars and linguists and Hanafi Maturidi theologian, Al-Kafiji or Kafieji, in his book called Al-Farah wa Surur, which is a work on Usul al-Fiqh, he spoke about tawleed, or turning the different branches of fiqh into independent disciplines from fiqh, right? And he said that there isn't any restriction in that, and he was pro the idea that some of the disciplines of some of the aspects of fiqh could evolve into independent ulum, right? So he spoke about that in al-Farah wa Surur, and he also went forth on talking about the logical possibility of a fifth madhab, and so on and so forth, right? But I mean, we could put that aside, the notions of ijtihad and so on. But he spoke actively about, or he spoke in an energetic way, I would say, about this idea of tawleed al-ulum. And I haven't seen anything similar to what he wrote in that book from other scholars, at least in the vibe of it. So this is in terms of tawleed al-ulum, taking an aspect of a discipline, for example, or a certain principles, and then deriving from it some kind of a new science. This is one issue. The other, there's the social aspect, I would say, for ilm to evolve, right? So I mean, Rafi' al-Din al-Dihlawi in Takmil al-Sana'a, he spoke about different ulum of Shah Waliullah al-Dihlawi, kind of like ulum that Shah Waliullah al-Dihlawi founded, right? But some of these ulum did not grow because there hasn't been scholars who studied these ulum, or classes or communities of scholarship that have basically embraced the science by deliberating and debating about its ideas and concepts and positions, where schools would emerge and so on. In Adāb al-Mutala, there are different schools, but some of the sciences that are mentioned by Rafi' al-Din al-Dihlawi didn't really emerge as science, or didn't move beyond Shah Waliullah Dihlawi and the Dihlawis, the immediate Dihlawis after him. So there's a social aspect which is discussed by Ibn Khaldun, by the way, about why ulum progress or evolve, or how they evolve, in a sense, how they come about, and the need of using nomenclature, where does it come from, and so on and so forth. Ibn Khaldun uses this social approach. I think what you were alluding to is more a logical approach, meaning, what I mean by logical, not merely rational, but logical in the sense of applying the principles of logic, of studying the mabadi' of ulum, for example, or the relationship between mabadi' and masail, and seeing ways how you can do the tawleed, you can do the branching of new sciences, or the deriving new sciences from there. The last aspect of your question about using certain principles of some of the in our ilm to solve the problems in another ilm, this issue, Shihab al-Din al-Qarafi talks about it in his treatise on Nahu, but I apologize, I can't remember the title of Shihab al-Din al-Qarafi's work on grammar at the moment. But in that work, he mentions that any science would require at least one or more sciences through which its ambiguous aspects can be solved, and you could say the gray areas of it can be treated, or can be cleared. Shihab al-Din al-Qarafi speaks about that, but he didn't speak as much about how close these sciences are, right? He didn't so for example, you can easily understand this in terms of, let's say, fiqh and nahu, right? If you or lugha in general, if you're studying the book on ayman, right, on oaths, and so basically part of that is knowing language and which words can be used, which expressions can be used to make an oath, versus words that are not counted as as an oath and so on and so forth. And without a strong understanding in language, and by the way, people don't know that Hanafis were one of the early scholars who write about language and fiqh. And Imam Muhammad bin Hassan went really deep into that. He had as a great addressed these issues in great linguistic depth when it comes to issues related to Iman, right? So sometimes the relationship between these sciences is apparent, is obvious. In other cases, it is not so apparent. Having said that, there has been also another aspect to what you mentioned. There's been also scholars who come from, you could say, different backgrounds, so to speak, and then they write books on the they write books from their own, you could say, with a fresh perspective. Let me give you an example. Would be Ibn al-Nafis, who wrote a 2-volume work on grammar. But most of the grammarians of his time, as mentioned by Taj al-Subki in al-Tabaqat, if I recall correctly, they didn't really appreciate his book. They didn't celebrate his book. But Ibn Nafis used to have these night talks and discussions with Jamal al-Din ibn Wasil, who was a Shafi'i jurist. And one of the students of Ibn Nafis, it was a famous Jewish physician. Maybe has the name, I forgot his name now. This is mentioned by Salah ad-Din al-Safadi in Al-Wafi bil-Wafayat. So this Jewish student of Ibn Nafis used to go to Ibn Nafis's house and would spend time with him there. So he said, one night I went and he was having this discussion with Jamal al-Din ibn Wasil after Isha, and I went to sleep. He said, I woke up before the time of dawn, and Jamal al-Din ibn Wasil was really furious. He said his face was turning red, and his veins. I could see his veins pulsating, right? And Ibn Nafis was so relaxed, moving from one discipline to another very freely, right? And it doesn't feel pressured. So he said, I heard Jamal al-Din ibn Wasil says to Ibn Nafis, أما نحن, as for us, فعندنا مسائل ونكت وقواعد. We have مسائل, issues, nukat meaning intricate matters, and principles. أما أنت, but as for you, فأما أنت فعندك خزائن علوم. You have treasures of knowledge, right? So Ibn Nafis was like basically going, freely from medicine to logic to language to this and that. And it is something that is studied recently in the, as they call it, the learning sciences. There was a study on a German principle, a German idea about it's an empirical study about how scholars who come from a different background, almost like how they do it with corporations. For example, they bring a consultant who's from outside the organization because they can see things with a fresh perspective. They talk about how some scientists who come from a different background can solve some of the problems of another science because they come with a fresh perspective, so to speak. But we have to take this with a pinch of salt, because this empirical study has been applied and conducted on the current condition of our world, which is specialization. Back then, this specialization was not even there, right? So most scholars were generalists, right? Meaning, they had to study all the different sciences. We had an event in Malaysia a week ago. It was on Qi in Arab Greco-medicine. And I used the work by Shaykh al-Islam Hassan al-Attar, which is a critical commentary on Nuzhat al-Abdan by Dawood al-Antaki. And Shaykh al-Islam Hassan al-Attar is Shaykh al-Azhar. People know him for his Hashiyah on Jam' al-Jawami'. But he has this thick volume on tib, on the principles of medicine, and you could see the mastery that he had. And in some cases, like he would say, look, I'm away from home now. Not all the book. I don't have all my books. I don't have all this. But I hope what I mentioned thus far is enough. And thus far that he, is saying that, is enough is like, 5 pages long. And he says, I apologize, I couldn't go on for more. But it's like 5 pages and it would take like hours to decipher. I'm not really sure if I answered your question, but maybe, I mean, in some of these references, you can find you can find something beneficial. I'm not sure.
Inshallah, barakallahu fikum, Sayyidina. We have a question from Abdullah.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for a very interesting lecture. I just wanted to ask you, what do you think the role of this Adāb al-Mutali is in terms of preparing, not just preparing, but also, I suppose, being complementary to, or even something that's associated to students studying Islamic studies in modern universities, because the whole approach to text is so completely different. And you mentioned at the beginning something like this is sort of a juxtaposition to the postmodern approach to reading text. So I was wondering if you could talk about how it might be possible to establish this type of traditional reading whilst students are so engaged in or drowning in this very unrooted postmodern approach. And do you think that it would be a way of reviving the sciences sort of alongside that, or as an alternative to that? So, sorry for my poorly worded question.
No, not at all. Barakallahu ta'ala feekum. Barakallahu ta'ala feekum. Well, I think the answer is twofold. Number one, with these principles or with this science help, for example, let's say with the type of books that are written in universities nowadays, basically they're in the form of lecture notes, one would say. Lecture notes are pretty much straightforward, where definitions are highlighted. The definition says, "I am a definition," where the argument said, or the proof for a certain position says, "I'm here. You can, please read me. I am the proof for so and so opinion." When textbooks are written in a very direct way, you can still benefit from it, but the real benefit comes when you read classical textbooks, right? And I would say, even if you apply if you contextualize these principles to works that are written in other languages as well, because we know these principles, by the way, by Allama Hamid al-Ghifari, I'm pretty sure that he knew Persian very well. Shaykh Ahmed Mufleh probably knew Persian very well, and also Ottoman Turkish as well. So these scholars mastered more than one language. And I would assume that you used to apply these to different languages as well. So basically, any textbook that was a classical textbook, right? You can apply these. Principles with or without contextualization. It would depend in reading them. But the textbooks that are written like device manuals, like a manual that you have with your new mobile phone. These don't really, you won't really look for to the unwritten qualifiers, for example, right? Or as they say, al-Qiyud al-Maskut anha, the qualifiers that the scholars were silent about. This is something very famous in fiqh, for example. There are qualifiers that scholars were silent about for particular reasons. You will not find that in manuals that come with devices or home appliances. And unfortunately, in modern day schools and universities, sometimes they provide textbooks as such, and that doesn't really help the student develop a mastery of knowledge, but it becomes more of they become a better user of the knowledge rather than developing a level of mastery or scholarship of the knowledge. They become users, basically. They know how to use now whatever science that they're studying. And subhanallah, I mean, I did an IELTS exam a few days ago, and then when I just received my results today. Alhamdulillah, I had 9 out of 9 in reading. But when I was looking at this scale, I wanted to know, like, okay, what does these numbers mean? And when I looked at the scale, they they put the score, and then for the person who gets 9, they say expert user, user of the language, right? So yeah, some people can make the argument this would, it doesn't have any kind of like a modernistic underpinnings to it, but the idea of the user of a language rather than knowledgeable of it, but is a very good, an expert user versus a very good user, right? So this is the one fold. The second fold, you mentioned the postmodernist approach to reading. Well, this is where there's a lot of effort that need to be conducted. I mean, reviving Adāb al-Mutali. I remember I had this discussion with my Shaykh Hussein El Azhary on Adāb al-Mutali a few years back, and basically he spoke to me that I need to work on a project that we would call it يعني إحياء المؤلف, the revival of the author, right? إحياء المؤلف. And the revival of the author can come through reviving Adāb al-Mutali, because Adāb al-Mutali orbits around that the author is alive, And Sayyidi Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani, when he comes to read a book, number one, they would recite Fatiha. And this is also mentioned by Allama Naja al-Abyari. Allama Naja al-Abyari, a late Azhari scholar, is the generation after Shaykh al-Islam al-Bajuri. And Allama Naja al-Abyari, in his work, one of his works on grammar, or some questions, or you could say like almost like grammar or linguistic puzzles. I can't exactly recall the very subject of the book, but anyways, he mentioned in there in the beginning that it was part of the tradition of his teachers and the scholarly community that he was in, is that before they read, they recite the Fatiha and they give the reward to the author. And before that, Sayyidi Abdul Wahhab al-Sha'rani at the 10th century Hijri, he speaks about the etiquette for the reader if they decide when they're reading, for example, to stand up and go grab a cup of water, for example. He would say, I would have to take permission from the author, right? So he would say, Dastur or as-samah, my apologies. And then he would put the book and then would walk, go get water, answer the door, and then come back, right? But he would have to apologize. So they felt that the author is alive with them, right? They felt that there's a spiritual connection, with the authors of the tradition, and there is some kind of a barzakhi presence for the authors when their books are being read. And the stronger the connection between the reader and the author, the more the reader can derive meanings from that book, right? So at the end of the day, these are, when we read the words of our scholars, these scholars, alhamdulillah, many of the scholars, most of the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ are saints. Yes, saints are of different degrees, but are saints. And subhanallah, we know that in some in the dream that was I think was seen for Imam al-Ghazali, that if he was resurrected, or apologize, if he existed during the time of Bani Israel, he would have been a prophet, right? We know Imam al-Nawawi talked about Ihya Ulumuddin. He said, كاد الإحياء أن يكون قرآنا, right? And they speak of the scholars that because of their high spiritual rank and closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so the words that they uttered and the words that they wrote, those words are not words that are written by any other human being. Yes, of course, they are humans, la shak, there's no doubt, but these words, and we know the Prophet said, "Niyatul mu'min ablaghu min amalihi." The intention of the believer goes farther than his actions. So these words are meshed with the intentions, the ma'ani qalbiyya, the meanings of the hearts of these authors. So they have some kind of a spiritual presence. They are alive in a sense, right? So this is why Imam Sha'rani would seek permission spiritually from the author of the book that he's reading from when he needs to walk away. And I have dealt personally with teachers. I remember one day I was having this class with a teacher from India, and I was coming from the Cairo Book Festival, which takes place now in Cairo, and I had many books in my hands, right and left. And while I was entering, I had to take off my shoes or something like that. It was difficult for me while holding the books. So I put the books on the ground, and he ran and took the books himself, and he kept carrying the books until I, finishing putting off my shoes or wearing them. And he used to be very punctual about this issue, not to put a book on the floor. And he said, this is something that takes away the barakah, the blessing. So this reverence of the books, goes back to the reverence of the authors. They wouldn't stretch their feet towards, the bookshelves, right? Because in reverence to the authors. So the authors have some kind of a presence, a spiritual presence with a student. Coming back to the postmodern that you mentioned in your question, well, the postmodern, the spiritual aspect is not there. This one hand. On the other, and also in a purely rational or logical aspect, if you're reading a textbook of that was written in the Islamic tradition, and you completely ignore the meaning, and then you project your own meanings, that goes back to to the relativity, right, or relativism, and nisbiyya, and nisbiyya, absolute relativism as well, because who would say which meaning that would be projected to the traditional text is valid or not? Actually, the whole idea of validity is no longer there, right? Postmodernism is not about validity or truthfulness. Postmodernism is about, whether the idea is interesting or not, right? But it's not about validity. It's not about truthfulness. It basically pollutes the mind, right? Because one would lose the compass to distinguish between what is right, what is wrong, what is truthful, and what is false. And the Prophet ﷺ in the hadith, he said that at the end of times, not only that people would not only that people would not know right from wrong, but they would consider what is wrong to be right and what is right to be wrong, what is truth to be false and what is false to be the truth. And to me, this hadith speaks about postmodernism, because this could only happen if people collectively are buying into this absolute relativism, right? I think not only through reviving, the Adāb al-Mutali', but also reviving the philosophies, the underpinning philosophical positions behind Adāb al-Mutali' versus the underpinning philosophical positions behind the postmodern reading, which is postmodernism itself. Because we might think, okay, by merely reviving Adāb al-Mutali', then we're countering postmodernist readings. No, we have to revive the philosophies that are behind Adāb al-Mutali', or as well as critiquing the philosophy that is behind the postmodern reading. So you will find, subhanAllah, after all what I have just said, it boils down to حقائق الأشياء ثابتة والعلم بها متحقق. So it comes back to the first statement of al-aqaid nasafiyya, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah. Actually, we opened up a subject that deserves its own lecture, inshallah. And we do intend to have you with us at Usul again to elaborate further on this topic, bi'iznillahi ta'ala, inshallah, because it's extremely important in this postmodern age. Alhamdulillah, very beautiful, mashallah. So, Sidna, we're going to have to leave it at that, inshallah. Of course, you need to get some rest. And we have one final question very quickly. Students are asking, where can they purchase your book from?
Okay, so Adāb al-Mutali', the Adāb al-Mutali', the old edition is out of print, and it's available in PDF. So it's it's floating on Telegram and so on and so forth. So it's available for them, inshallah. there's no issue. And
Inshallah.
they have my tacit permission as well too. I mean, if they're concerned, if
Inshallah.
they download it or something, it's out of the copyrights of the publishing house. So you're not
Inshallah.
stealing or anything if you download it. Don't worry, and inshallah.
Inshallah. I'm sure in the next split second they'll have a copy found somewhere in PDF online. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and thank you, Maulana, for this wonderful and amazing lecture. I'd also like to remind everyone that for those of you who are not part of Usul, who are just guests, we welcome you to join the Usul family. Our BA, MA, Diploma, and Arabic programs are now open for applications, inshallah. So if you want to see more of these and want to find out more also about Usul, we will have the info sessions coming up, inshallah, before Ramadan. Is that correct, Tala? And we will be also having a number of Ramadan events بإذن الله تعالى. Okay. طيب اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. جزاكم الله خيرا.
والسلام. جزاكم الله خير.
السلام عليكم.
جزاكم الله خير.